So now we come to a part of the course that is my favorite in many ways. Because if we can make decisions, we can start to have computers actually behave in the ways we want. We can make them do interesting things and respond different ways to different situations. This is really what makes programming interesting. I think at this point is when you're really starting to do real programming. But we start with the simplest possible way of making decisions. We start with the simple version of the if statement. And we have the simple grammar here. We have the keyword if, a space, a condition, and I'll discuss that in a moment, and then of course the colon. Colon's very important, essential part of the syntax, and then any number of statements. When we look at those statements, by the way, what we're saying with an if condition is that Python will test that condition during runtime. When it executes the if statement, it will test that condition, whether it is currently true or false. If it is true, it will execute all the statements. If it's not true, it will skip past all the statements. So it's a pretty simple programming construct. And we will see in a moment that the indentation really matters, just as it mattered with function calls and function definitions. It's absolutely critical that all those statements are at the same level with any given if condition, as you'll see. Also, condition, as we'll see, is typically a Boolean condition. And by Boolean, I mean something that is clearly either true or false, such as comparing two numbers. I mean, A equals B, and that's A equal B, of course. A equal B, either it's true or it's not true, true or false. You don't have to use Boolean conditions here. You can actually put in any object as a condition, but I think especially when you start, you'll probably want to stick with Boolean conditions most of the time because it will simply be more obvious what the program is doing. So here's an example. This just shows us what the conditions are typically like, and it shows us a couple of statements in each case that must be correctly aligned with the same indentation. So real simple example, we have a variable called age. We assume it has already been set, by the way, or else this will be a syntax error, but assuming age has already been given a value somewhere, we say if age is greater than 40, colon's important, and then, of course, if the value is greater than 40, both these statements will be true. We'll print the message, you're getting up there, and then it sets a variable called isOldTimer, and it sets that to true to rub it in. Then the second example is very similar, but it adds a condition. So a few lessons ago, I talked about there being the logical operators which combine Boolean conditions. So how do we test whether someone's a teenager? Well, one way to do it, very simple, is we take that same variable called age. We say if age is greater than 12 and age is less than 20, then you must be a teenager. So obviously we understand what and means. This is a simple word and from English, and both those conditions must be true. If they are, both statements are executed. If they're not true, we skip over both. Now, that was the simple if statement. I'm going to throw you a fairly simple curve that's not too hard. We can say if something is true, execute these statements, or else we can optionally have an else clause, which is what to do if the condition is not true, then it will execute the else clause. So let's say age is 50. That first condition isn't going to be true, so we'll execute the else clause, and the else clause says you are not a teenager. Then we have one final feature to the if statement, just to throw more stuff at you here. You can optionally have any number of elif clauses. Now, elif simply means else if. And in some languages, you would literally type in else space if. You would do that in C. In Python, you just type in elif. So we can produce code like this, which gets a command number from the user. It then tests that command number for different values. So if that number is 1, do command 1. If that number is 2, do command 2. If that number is 3, do command 3. And finally, we have a default condition, and it says do command 4. We assume, by the way, that these functions are already defined before we attempt to execute them. But this is a typical use of if, elif, and else. So let's do a little mini review here. If statement is really quite simple on the whole, but it's flexible in Python. You have a lot of choices. If you use this kind of testing, you're always going to have an if clause. You're always going to have exactly one. You may have any number of elif clauses, 0, 1, or many. Remember, those are else-if clauses in effect. You can have at most one else clause. You'll either have 0 or 1. And the else clause is default action. It says if none of these conditions are true, then do the else clause. Do those statements. And each statement block can have one or more statements. Remember, they must be aligned. And by the way, there's something I did not mention. Probably won't use this very often, but it's something to keep in mind. If I want a no-op, if I want any of those statements blocked to be a no-op, I can just use the keyword pass. Now let's talk a little bit about nested if statements, because this may very well be on the exam. And you start with the concept that the statements inside an else block are themselves statements that can also be if statements if you want. So in other words, you can fit an if statement inside another if statement. Why would you do that? Well, we're going to show you why in a moment. The more complex logic you have, the more complex the behavior of the program you have, the more likely you're going to use this sort of thing. So this becomes very, very useful. And when we place one loop inside an if, or a loop inside a loop, or an if inside an if, this is called nesting. And Python will let you nest to any level. You will run out of screen space long before you will exhaust the ability of Python to recognize nested statement blocks. And an important point to keep in mind here, because this is Python, the really critical thing to keep in mind with nested if statements in Python is that the indentation of each level must be consistent. And as we add nesting, we're going to go over another level. So we see it here. This is actually a very, very simple program we're going to run in a moment, but it does illustrate nesting. So we're going to assume that age and fav are two variables that have already been set. And first we're going to test and see if someone's a teenager. Okay, so we say if age is greater than 12 and age is less than 20, you're a teenager. But we also want to see if you're a cool teenager, right? So, and this is going to show my age a little bit, but you're cool if you like the Beatles. So what we do is first we see if you're a teenager, we test for that. And if you are, then we do this additional test. This is the nested if. If you're not a teenager, we just skip down to this other block. So essentially, we test for this one situation. If that's true, then we're going to go and do this additional test. Now, what you will see here, and this is absolutely critical, again, is that the indentation at each level must be absolutely consistent, or Python gets confused, and it will complain, and it will give you a syntax error, and you'll have to re-enter it. But notice that these different statements are not all at the same level of indentation. They are at the right indentation for their level. So in other words, when we create a statement block, we go over one level, which in this case is 4 spaces, and that must be consistent. Whatever it is, we must stick with that. Then, because we're nesting, we're creating another level, and then we have to go over another 4 spaces. So we have different levels of indentation, but those levels of indentation show the control flow in the program. Okay, so let's try it out. First of all, we're going to have to enter some values for age and a value for fav. So what is your favorite group? Okay, well, mine is the Beatles, so we will use that for now. So now we're going to create this elaborate if-else statement. And I will note here that Python will allow you to keep entering these statements until the blocks are grammatically complete, and you'll see how this works. So enter that initial condition, which is a complex condition. It combines 2 different tests. We type the colon, and it should automatically indent for us. It does. Now we enter the nested condition. And by the way, once again, I've said this many times, I'll say it one more time. When we are testing for equality, we use double equal signs. We use single equal sign for assignment. So remember to use double equal signs when you're doing a Boolean condition. So if your favorite group is the Beatles, and now notice how we did another colon, Python automatically, or rather the idle environment of Python automatically did another indentation because we are now at a deeper level in the logical flow. And if that is true, we say, you're a cool teen. And else, this is the else within the inner if statement. But guess what? I didn't enter the colon. And this shows you why it's important. We'll do it over. But this shows you why when you're using the interactive environment to do if statements and else statements, you must have the colon. So this was useful. It demonstrated that you must use the colon as part of this syntax. Okay, now it's happy. Now notice I'm using double quotation marks here. Why am I doing that? Because that makes it easy to embed a single quotation mark. So we'll move the cursor back here so it lines up. We say else, and it's critical here to have the colon. I think it might be missing from the screen. So the PowerPoint slide needs to be corrected here. You do have to have the colon. So we are correcting it here. The colon after each else statement is absolutely important. Now, at this point, we're moving the cursor all the way back to the edge of the screen because now we are creating the alternative to the main if statement. And once again, we get the proper indentation, which should now be at this level, as shown on the screen. You are not a teenager. Let's make the quotation marks match to keep Python happy. You are young or old. So this is the end of this great big if-else nested thing. And it ends when I enter twice. Oh, and it ran it. Okay, so it accepted this big old piece of logic and then it ran it. And so what it did is it took the values of age and fave. So my age is 15 and I like the Beatles, so I'm a cool teen. Now if my favorite group was somebody else, I would be the uncool. And if my age was not in teenage range, it would have told me that. So once again, let's do a mini summary. Decision-making is supported by the if, elif, and else keywords. You'll want to be able to use all of them. Such a structure will have exactly one if clause. So we have exactly one if clause. We're testing one condition. We're testing, although it may be complex. And you can be as simple as a mere if statement, a mere if followed by statements if you want. But you can have 0 or more elif clauses. That means the same thing as else if, but it's one word. You can have 0 or 1 else clauses. Don't forget the colon. When we tried typing in things before and forgot the colon, it complained we had to start over. Remember, indentation matters, and nesting, which is putting one thing inside another, is supported to any level.